those rations survive the week. And this gives way to what the Ministry of Information and the Ministry of Food described as the kitchen front, that women had a key role to play in the war effort in the kitchen. This was their key contribution. One of the remarkable things about rationing is that over the course of the war, the nutritional health of the British population actually improved. Because nutritionists were involved in the calculation of nutritional allowances and of the types of foods that would be able to deliver that. Here in itself was a very fine example of the type of positive benefit, positive social benefit, and active state involvement in the planning and distribution of food supply could give out. Rationing was also about the creation of a new sense of community. And so one of the things that they did was create a new type of restaurant called the British restaurant, very unimaginatively named, but they were basically communal restaurants where you could go and eat very cheaply. By 1943, there were over 2,000 of them serving over 600,000 meals a day. There were 281 in London of all. And they were meant to be places where people from all classes could go and eat cheaply and nutritionally. In fact, they were deeply unpopular. Many people didn't attend, and the Wartime Social Survey found that only 20% of the population had actually been in one. But the image of the communal restaurant was an important one, and the vision of community that it created. But of course, rationing, despite its universality, still had an uneven effect on the population. And the chief reason for that was the existence of a black market for foods. People who had more money could afford to buy additional foods on the black market, and luxury foods, things like caviar, for instance, was unrationed because there was no shortage of supply for it. So high-end London restaurants like the Savoy continued to do a roaring trade. In fact, they actually increased their trade during the Second World War because high-end restaurants were a way in which the rich were able to continue to eat well. It also made a difference, of course, whether you lived in the city or the countryside. If you lived in the countryside, you could harvest the foods of the countryside. You could snare rabbits, you could pick blackberries and other fruits that grew wild, you could shoot birds, etc., 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 which people in the cities were not able to do. But of course, the greatest difference was between those in Britain and those across the rest of the empire. And the biggest sign of the inequity of food provision was the very horrendous famine in Bengal in 1943, where an estimated 3 million people died as a consequence of the famine, which basically was a consequence of the fall of Singapore in 1942 and the loss of the rice imports that came in from Burma. But there was still plenty of food in India. The question was one of the distribution of it to the most vulnerable people, which the government was ineffective at doing. And this became a huge cause célèbre for the nationalist movement and was very important in their campaigns for independence thereafter, which comes rapidly after the end of the war. So universality, equality, but still strains of important difference and exceptions. The same is true of the experience of civilian bombing and the Blitz. During the Blitz, 43,000 civilians die and 1 million homes are destroyed. It creates a massive housing shortage in Britain, which post-war urban development tries for many decades to make good, as we'll see in the coming weeks. Britain was in many ways, a bomb site for the best part of a decade or two after the Second World War. But out of this experience of the Blitz came the propagation of a new sense of social community, a new idea that everybody was in it together and everybody had to help each other out. And that was, in a way, best symbolised in the communality of the air shelters. So in London especially, the tube stations were used as communal air raid shelters, where people of all classes could go to get below ground. But, as you can see from this image, there were also private shelters, known as Anderson shelters, that you could buy a kit and dig these shelters into your back garden. And this was something that really only the suburban middle class could afford to do, or indeed had the space in their gardens to do. So there's differences of class that are established in terms of the experience of the Blitz. There's also differences of geography, again, in that the areas that suffer most during the Blitz are the heavy industrial areas around London, around the ports of London, Belfast, Glasgow, Plymouth, and Coventry, which are the cities that are most badly hit during the Blitz. Because working class housing is close to the big industrial sites in these areas, it's the working class houses that are most frequently destroyed en masse. So, just like rationing, the experience of bombing had real an uneven experience for many Britons. Let me talk about evacuation. To deal with the imminence of German bombing raids, it was decided to evacuate children from these urban industrial areas. And over the course of the war, 3.5 million children are relocated outside of these areas. That happens in 3 phases: in September 1939, immediately after the declaration of war, during the Blitz itself, and in 1944, when there was a new wave of doodlebugs. Doodlebugs were like drones, basically. They were unmanned bombs that came over, you would hear them, then the engine would cut out, and when the engine cut out, you knew you were in trouble because it would like scream, on the way down to hit the ground. So 3 waves, but the real idea behind evacuation was that the nation was one big family. The nation was a family in which the children were transferable units. So it would make sense that any family would take in the children of another family because they were all in it together. Everybody would help each other out. Of course, the real issue about evacuation was that it was predominantly working class children that were part of the official schemes of evacuation. And these working class children were bussed out or sent out on rail to evacuation depots where families would come in and pick the kids that they wanted. It's like that horror in the school playground when you're playing kickball, and you're the last kid to be chosen. Not that ever happened to me, obviously. But that type of horror of informal selection. Despite the fantastic idea behind evacuation, of the idea that the nation was one big family, what in fact it did was to emphasise really profound social differences. So middle-class families in the countryside, which tended to be the ones that would take in working-class children, were deeply shocked very often at the scale of poverty and ill health of the kids that they were picking up. There were also real scandals that began to break around evacuation, of families taking in children and basically using their ration cards to supplement the food of the entire family and treating the kids that they're hosting, putting them on a very minimal diet, or using them to do forms of domestic labour and even of physical abuse. Middle classes were basically not part of this official evacuation scheme. Instead, what they would do was make arrangements informally with friends or part of their extended family. So my mother, for instance, was evacuated from London to go live down in an area about 40 miles away with the family of someone that her father worked with. He worked in the sort of Clapham area. My father did the same thing, was sent down to a farm down in Devon. That's a very different type of experience of evacuation to the official one. Social scientists had a field day during this operation because they were hugely interested in the consequences of evacuation for children. And one of the key figures here was John Bowlby, the psychologist, who, along with a whole bunch of other psychologists and psychiatrists, began to study the psychic effects of evacuation on children. And John Bowlby develops this theory of attachment theory about the importance of intimate relationships between mothers and their children in order to develop a well-adjusted child. And he basically argued, and I'll come back to this in a future thing, that if that attachment between mother and child is severed at a too early age, that you would end up with a child with deeply antisocial tendencies, that were, of course, termed juvenile delinquents later. So the idea that came out of this was actually the profound importance of the family unit being maintained together. I'm going to run through this and then I'll stop so any of you can ask me some questions. I've already said that the Second World War was no less of an imperial war than the First World War. Bless you. And you'll remember that after the First World War, colonial soldiers often felt very disappointed about their lack of political rights that followed their contribution to the defence of the British Empire. There's a sneezing bug going around. We've all got to get to spring break, not sick. So the colonial office is very concerned about this from the get-go. And one of the things that they do is to try and address this issue at the beginning is to lift the colour bar in the military, to allow basically mixed regiments of soldiers. Nonetheless, it's the case that despite the lifting of the colour bar and the differentiation of so-called coloured regiments from white regiments, that all colonial soldiers were put under the control of British officers. Colonial soldiers weren't considered to be strategically or effective enough to run their own regiments. It's also the case that there were no black servicemen in the Navy. There was a big population of so-called coloured seamen in the merchant Navy, but none in the Navy per se. And Winston Churchill was also insistent that insofar as black medics contributed to the war effort, they should not serve white servicemen. The Caribbean and African and South Asian medics, of which there are a number, should basically attend only to colonial soldiers. So there's a lifting of this colour bar, but it's a sort of grudging one, almost. Nonetheless, there's a very important emphasis on this idea of colonial partnership, an emphasis on partnership across the British Empire. That rather than the British Empire being structured in this deeply hierarchical way, with everybody rallying around the chief of all nations, the mother country of Britain, instead the propaganda was that everybody was contributing to the war effort as a family, and that there wasn't that ingrained hierarchy. And this type of rhetoric becomes very important also after the Second World War because it becomes the basis of the new idea of the Commonwealth of Nations, the shift from the British Empire to an idea of a Commonwealth of Nations. I'm pausing because I've lost my train of thought. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go. There was a huge contention in Britain with the arrival of the belated arrival of American servicemen. And one of the reasons why this was so contentious was because, of course, the colour bar continued to exist in the American military. Churchill tried very hard to be in discussions about the lifting of this colour bar. It was considered politically impossible in the American context. And so American military bases and regiments in Britain, housed in Britain, continued to have the very form of racial segregation that the British military had worked so hard to move away from. There were 130,000 African-American GIs in Britain, and for the towns surrounding those, like my hometown of Ipswich, which was very near a whole series of American military bases, now had to have distinct bars and clubs just for those GIs, because they weren't allowed to mix socially with other people. But of course, they found a way, and much to the horror of their commanding officers and to some of the popular press, there were 2,000 mixed-race babies born in the UK during the war as a consequence of romantic relationships with these African-American GIs. And of course, British women fell head over heels in love with the strapping American men that came over to serve with their ample rations and their ample supply of nylon tights. There were 70,000 British war brides that returned to the US after the Second World War. I'm not going to get into the Bevan Boys stuff. So do we have any questions before we hit this last section of the lecture and ease gracefully into the experience of spring break? No? Yes? It was pretty much out of the picture. I mean, in part because it wasn't a pretty picture from Britain. The fall of Singapore was really considered to be a massive psychic blow to the British Empire. You know, many people think the fall of Singapore is the beginning of the end of the British Empire. You know, this humbling of the British military. So it's something that's out of that doesn't get anywhere near as much coverage as the war in Europe, or indeed the war in North Africa and the Middle East, both of which get a lot more coverage. Okay. Yeah. That's a great question, Millie. They are basically utterly supportive, in part because they're given a seat at the table in an unprecedented type of way. You have a national government in Britain during the Second World War, and a national government that has, unlike the national government in the First World War, a good number of ministers that came out of the labour movement. And many, and I'm going to move on to this now, many of the issues about Reconstruction develop in conversation with the trade union movement. And I'm going to come on to that now. So I talked last week, I think, about the increasing vogue for planning and the idea of sort of government and scientific planning in the 1930s. And this is really significant because suddenly, between 1940 and 1942, there's an unbelievable amount of plans for the post-war period published. People begin to have an active discussion about what Britain in the post-war period was going to look like. Churchill, when he became Prime Minister, actually had got rid of the War Aims Committee that had been established in August of 1939, and basically wanted to put off any conversation about post-war planning because, he argued, Britain just had to survive the war, and before anyone could think about the future, that the war had to be won. Nonetheless, he concedes to the creation in February 1941 for a new cabinet committee on Reconstruction, headed by a member of the Labour Party called Greenwood, and that plays a very important role because out of one of its subcommittees emerged a document that was hugely influential for what happens in Britain after the war. It's a report known as the Beveridge Report. Beveridge had, you remember, been under Lloyd George's wing before the First World War, had devised things like the labour exchanges, had devised a rationing system in Britain during the First World War, had served as the director of the London School of Economics between the wars, and was made head of this interdepartmental committee on social insurance that had been created in 1941. The Beveridge Report is a key text that you have to get very, very familiar with, because what it does is lay the foundation for the creation of the welfare state in Britain. It expands the system of social insurance that had existed since 1911 into a universal scheme of social insurance that would embrace all of society, not just certain privileged workers as before. And the idea of this collection of social insurance for the whole country was that it would provide new forms of welfare that would cover people from the cradle to the grave, that the state would secure the welfare of its citizens from their birth to their death. And it outlined 5 great evils that it sought to put an end to: want, squalor, ignorance, idleness, and disease. Want, squalor, ignorance, idleness, and disease. Such was the impact of this report. Remember, this is an official government report. When you start reading it, you'll understand that this is not a gripping read. And yet, it gets an amazing reception. 92% of the population knew of its existence a day after its publication, according to opinion polls, and 100,000 copies of it were sold in the first month. The total sales ended up at 630,000, and there were even 50,000 sold in the US. In 1943, Lord Walton, fresh from his success in the Ministry of Food, is appointed Minister for Reconstruction. Okay, so now you have basically a Conservative minister in charge of the plans for Reconstruction, in which this radical new agenda is in place. Now, one reason why this report is so important is that it was well advertised and discussed, not just in the popular press, but in the army itself. And in 1941, they created something called the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, or ABCA, which was meant to facilitate discussion amongst servicemen. Okay, so the thing about the Army Bureau of Current Affairs is it was remarkably like the Left Book Club. It published short 16-page pamphlets, and those 16-page pamphlets were designed for public discussion in barracks that was facilitated by one officer. But basically, if I played you more of that clip, it was all about hearing from the men and trying to educate the men in the big issues after the war. And it's often suggested that the Army Bureau of Current Affairs plays a key role in terms of putting out knowledge about the Beveridge Report in the armed forces. Right. So let me wrap up. In one way, the English Revolution that George Orwell so longed for during the Second World War did arrive. It arrived in 1945 when, against all the odds, against all the predictions, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, the heroic Prime Minister that had saved Britain at the hands of German tyranny, was decisively thrashed at the election. For the first time ever, the Labour Party wins a massive majority of 149 seats in the House of Commons. It's the first major victory by the Labour Party. It's a scale of victory that the Labour Party didn't recapture until 1997, when Tony Blair was elected.